I'm going to introduce the last speaker, the keynote speaker, to end the meeting. I'm really pleased to have Annalee Newitz here. Annalee is a scientific evangelist. Through her writings and her blogs and her television and radio interviews. Annalee's received a PhD from UC Berkeley in English and American Studies, and she, for the last decade and a half, has written very extensively about science in newspapers, magazines, many of them very influential and have major impacts from her writing. She runs a very popular science and science fiction blog called IO9. I urge you to visit it. Millions of people do visit it each month. And she's written several books about science. This is an unsolicited advertisement for a book that she has out, Scatter, Adapt, and Remember: How Humans Will Survive a Mass Extinction. This is the second part, How Humans Will Survive a Mass Extinction, is the title of her talk today. This is just coming out in paperback, and so I urge you after her talk to run to your local bookstores and get it. I have the hard copy version. There is one thing quite unique about Annalee that really impresses me. She really takes science and genomics very seriously, and quite literally, she walks the talk and wears the talk. And so this is a tattoo that Annalee has on her arm, and that is really a commitment to genomics. And so we're talking about the JGI, and we're suggesting that all JGI employees need to get this tattoo to demonstrate their commitment. And so it's a pleasure to have you here, Annalee. And it is a pessimistic as well as an optimistic title of her talk: How Humans Will Survive a Mass Extinction.
So, yes, I'm going to talk to you today about mass extinction and how we might survive it. And as Eddie was suggesting, not only have I gotten myself tattooed, but I have been writing about science and the impact of science on the mainstream population on the world for about a decade and a half. And the way I explain to people what I do is basically that I try to put science into context for people. When I write about science for a general audience, that context can be anything from looking at how science is done in a lab, like here at JGI, and in fact, JGI has been a huge inspiration for me in my work, not just because it's an awesome place to work and you guys have really cool machines, which admittedly are quite fun to look at, but also because the kind of work that's coming out of here, I think, does a terrific job of bridging the gap between really basic science and stuff that the public can understand has applications for their lives. And that's really what we hope that science can do. But the other way that I like to contextualize science is really in the context of the world, how it can change the world, just like how the Avengers can fix the world. How can science really affect people's lives, and how we can kind of tell stories about science and the ways that it's transformed us as a civilization and as individuals. So today, I'm just going to focus on a really small, this is the second ad you're having for my book, sorry about that. So I'm going to focus on a context that I've been looking at a lot in the last couple of years as I've been researching this book, which was, since you guys all talk about who funded your research and your papers, I'm going to tell you that my research was funded by Doubleday, which is owned by Random House, which means that the publishing industry is still funding research, so that's good. So print is not quite dead. But anyway, so for the past couple of years, I've been researching this question of what is a mass extinction and how might we survive it. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. I'm going to give you a taste of mass extinction and then a little bit of a sense of what it takes to survive. And we'll sort of look at it from the 2 billion year view. So let me give you the large context. I think that these slides are not quite doing what they need to be doing here. Yes, let's try that. So I actually really like this representation. Oh, now they're going to go through some kind of routine. Sorry, now you have spoilers. Snowball Earth comes next, you guys. So this is an illustration of the geological periods that we've had on Earth since, about 4.6 billion years ago when the planet was formed. And you can see on here that extinctions are kind of marked. And so when I talk about mass extinction, what I mean is something quite specific, which is any time that 75% or more of all species on the planet die out. And it usually is over a period of about 1 million years. You may have heard about mass extinctions that were really fast, such as the one that killed off most of the dinosaurs, although not all of them, since we all have seen birds today probably, and they are in fact survivors of that mass extinction. But really, every mass extinction is actually a fairly slow in human time process, although fast in geological time. So even if you have a really massive event, like an asteroid hitting the planet, or like what I'm going to talk about later, a megavolcano, you still see a rather slow, again, by human scale, attrition of animal and plant life and other kinds of life as well. So we've had 5 of these mass extinctions on Earth since the evolution of multicellular life. So for about the last 500 million years, 5 of these events have occurred. We've also, and remember, these are huge extinction level events, right? 75% or more species on the planet. There have been plenty of other mini extinctions, you might say, or mini mass extinctions, where like 30% die off, 40% die off. If you're somebody who looks at mass extinction, that's just like, who cares, with only 30%. But I mean, for us, if we were living through that, it would obviously be an incredible catastrophe, and our food webs would be completely screwed. So these are really, really quite enormous, literally earth-changing events. And what happens typically is that once one of these events is kind of petering out, you just see the emergence of a completely new set of ecosystems. So you really do, it's quite remarkable in the fossil record. You'll see a diversity of animals and plants, some kind of horrible event that takes place, often marked in the geological record, and then a whole new set of animals and plants that are emerging in their wake. So before I tell you about my favorite mass extinction, because everyone has a favorite mass extinction who studies this stuff, don't let anyone tell you otherwise, I want to contextualize for you the current situation that we're in on the planet. A lot of people, you may have even heard, are describing our current situation as entering into a 6th mass extinction. There's actually a terrific book out right now by Elizabeth Colbert called The 6th Extinction, which deals with this idea. And one of the notions put forth by people who subscribe to this idea is that we're seeing elevated extinction levels, and we're actually heading into an extinction event unlike any that we've ever seen before, and that it's happening really rapidly. And it's because of humans. It's all caused by our pumping carbon into the environment. And so keeping that in mind, and I'm not saying that's not true. We don't know. We don't have enough data yet because these things take time. But I want to remind you, by talking a little bit about Snowball Earth, about the most destructive species that has ever wrecked the environment on the planet. And you guys know what that is, right? Cyanobacteria, your friend. So your friend and mine, one of the earliest life forms to evolve on the planet. There's some debate about when it emerged, and of course, it's probably re-evolved a whole bunch of times, but probably evolved around 3 billion, 3.5 billion years ago. So the planet's pretty young at that point. Remember, it's 4.5 billion years old. And so you start to see the emergence of these cyano, and they are photosynthesizers, right? That's why they're so adaptable. They can live, the planet is completely covered in water, so they can live pretty much anywhere. They're basically eating sunlight. I mean, they're not eating sunlight, but they're using sunlight as their main fuel source to get their hydrogen. And they just spread everywhere. And they're spreading everywhere in an environment that's mostly archaea, or the ancestors of archaea. And most of those are probably anaerobic guys, so they don't need oxygen. The atmosphere on the planet is mostly methane at that point, and the life on the planet is like, yay, methane. We like methane. Methane is what we breathe. But then these cyano come along, and over a period of about 500 million or 1 billion years, they fart out so much oxygen that they completely destroy the environment. And they destroy it so much that they usher in this era, which geologists call Snowball Earth. And there may have actually been as many as 3 Snowball Earth periods. And what they were was times when the atmosphere became so heavily oxygenated that temperatures plummeted, and ice began to build up at the poles. And of course, the more ice that built up at the poles, the more light was reflected back into space, the cooler things got, and eventually you had a situation where basically the entire planet was covered in glaciers. And there's a geologist down at Caltech, Joe Kirschvank, who came up with the term Snowball Earth in a famous paper. And it's still kind of controversial, but there's a lot of evidence that's accumulated at this point beyond this one rock that his graduate student found back in the 80s. So it's more than just a theory at this point. It really does have quite a lot of evidence. And so we think that there were a couple of these, maybe 2 to 3 Snowball Earth periods, and that the last one ended right around the time of the beginning of the Cambrian, which is when we start to see multicellular life that can take advantage of an oxygen-rich atmosphere and can get energy from that. But meanwhile, cyanobacteria have polluted the planet to the point where all those archaea now are stuck living like next to volcanic vents at the bottom of the ocean. So just to keep in mind that humans are not the only horrible polluters, which isn't to say that we're not bad, but we're not the only ones. So let me tell you quickly about my favorite mass extinction, which is a very instructive one because it helps us understand how these mass extinctions happen. So this is the EndPermian Extinction. You can see it on here marked as gigantic extinction. It happened about 250 million years ago at a point when mammals hadn't really evolved yet. So sorry for those of you who really like mammalian cells. And what was going on at the time was the planet had one megacontinent. So instead of having the multiple continents we have today, there was one megacontinent called Pangaea, which was stretching from the North Pole to the South Pole on one side of the planet. And then there was this one massive ocean on the other side. And basically, at the beginning of the end, a megavolcano began to erupt in what is now Siberia. And in fact, if you go to Siberia now, there's an area called the Siberian Traps. It's a very beautiful area that's just all volcanic rock. And that's because this was a volcano that erupted for about 1,000 years. It wasn't like exploding, like it was a volcano that would have been just a crack that opened in the earth, kind of like the Icelandic volcano we had a couple years ago. So a large crack opened up, and basically what was coming out was you had magma coming out, but then also, of course, tons and tons and tons of carbon is coming out, other kinds of gases are coming out, and they're coming out for 1,000 years. So it's basically a kind of industrial revolution-sized event that's going on that's loading the atmosphere with carbon. The oceans became incredibly acidified. All of the coral reefs died off. There's this horrible there's this marker in the geological record that when you talk to geologists, they often will call it the slime spike, because what happens is you have so much death going on that the only thing that's really propagating are slimes. And you can see it in rock, like you'll literally see like a narrow black band that's just this era of slime in the wake of all of the death that's caused by all this carbon loading. And basically what happens is you have environmental change as a result of this mega volcano pumping carbon into the environment. Food webs collapse, and at the end, about 95% of all species on the planet had died out, including insects, and usually insects survive mass extinctions no problem. They were dying out as well. So lots of deaths in the ocean, lots of deaths on land, and by the end, you had slime world. And however, even in that dark time, there was one notable survivor. In fact, one of the only land animals to survive was this creature called Lystrasoros. Lystrasoros was a synapsid, which is a mammal-like reptile. So this was before mammals. They were about the size of pigs or dogs. You can see they had kind of a splay-foot gait, and they had these funny tusks. And they started out in the northern part of the continent and radiated out to the southern continent and speciated until basically, for maybe about 10 million years or so, they were pretty much the only land animal around. They were the tetrapod of the era, and there's many theories about why they survived and why they propagated, ranging from the idea that their natural predators died out during the extinction. They were also burrowing animals. They kind of burrowed underground looking for roots. And so one possibility is that their lungs were already adapted to breathe fairly dirty air, so they might have been able to survive in a really carbon-rich environment. No one really knows for sure, but what we do know is that they did survive by adapting, and by the time the ecosystems had recovered, which is really pretty far into the Triassic period, when you're starting to see the evolution of dinosaurs into something bigger than dogs, these guys were everywhere. And they really got me interested in survival. I had sort of started my research interested in mass destruction because, well, mass destruction is really interesting. And when I learned about these sort of humble pig-dog creatures surviving, partly just by spreading out, by adapting, by being willing to eat crap, and I mean, because that's kind of what's left after you have this horrible scourge of climate change, they survived. And I guess partly that's what got me thinking that humans might survive too. So make of that what you will. I mean, we are really good at adapting and eating crap. So, and that's actually going to turn out to be really important. When you think about survival of going through a mass extinction, I think humans tend to get really excited about all the things that make us special, like, but we have culture and technology and all this neat stuff, and that's true, and I'll be talking about that in a second. But one of the things that allows animals to survive these mass extinctions, and of course they have survived every single one of them, is that they live at a high population size, just like humans. They can eat a variety of things. Usually they're an invasive species, so they can live almost anywhere. And they adapt really quickly. And those are things that humans can do. Even if we're stripped of all of our nifty technologies, which sounds very sad, we're animals that are good at being invasive species and eating almost anything. So I think that we're set in terms of the next mass extinction. It's just a question of, will we survive in the style to which we've been accustomed? And so that's what I want to talk about next. So obviously, as I've just been saying, humans have this great thing called science. We've been doing it for a while, depending on where you live, maybe for 1,000 years, maybe for a couple hundred years, depending on what part of the world you're in. And one of the things that's great about science is that it allows us to look back at our own history as a species, but also to look back at the history of the planet and the history of the evolution of other species, and actually learn from the disasters that have already occurred. We can actually look back and say, like, hey, in the geological record, we can see that pretty much every single mass extinction has been caused by a perturbation of the carbon cycle. And that's basically true. There have been different precipitating factors, like a megavolcano in one case, asteroid hitting the Earth in another case, possibly cosmic ray bombardment in another case. You can ask me about that later. It's kind of a weird theory. But anyway, the point is, each of these mass extinctions has been caused by the carbon cycle getting out of whack, the environment's changing really rapidly. So if we look back and we see that, we can start to think, all right, what do we need to do next in order to make the coming era survivable, not just for us, but for our ecosystems as well, given that mass extinction is inevitable, because even if we aren't polluting, something else bad will happen, trust me. There'll be a megavolcano, there'll be an asteroid, something will get us. So what do we do to prepare? So the first thing, and this is great that I'm actually talking to an audience where I don't have to explain why synthetic biology is awesome or even what it is, but the first thing that I was thinking of when I looked into human survival was, how do we make cities better and more survivable environments? Because as the UN has said in a couple of reports now, of course, more than 50% of the human population live in cities currently. That number is expected to rise dramatically over the next 50 years. By the end of this century, we're looking at possibly as much as 75% of the population living in cities, particularly in the developed world, but also in the developing world too. The numbers are going up. So cities are an important area to focus and think about technology if we want to survive. So part of what we obviously need to be thinking about is, how do we make cities function more like organisms? And by that, I mean a lot of different things. One is really fundamentally, how do we make them carbon neutral? How do we make them fit into the natural environments where we build them or where they have been built? But also, how do we design cities so that they function better to be robust against disaster? So there's simple things we can do and things that you guys are already working on and that people in other labs are working on, like developing alternative fuels, biofuels, solar fuels. The artificial photosynthesis group here and at Caltech are doing some great stuff with trying to develop solar fuel. So all of that is a great start. And then we need to be starting to think about even just the building materials themselves. Right now, as actually June was pointing out this morning in her talk on plant biology, we're building our houses out of plants already. So how do we improve that process? And how do we improve the way that our cities function? So one fun example is thinking about self-healing materials. I live in San Francisco, so basically I'm constantly living in fear of the buildings and infrastructure crumbling around me because we've finally had another huge earthquake. We have pretty good earthquake engineering in San Francisco, but it would still be nice if we had something like self-healing concrete. This is actually an example of a project that was done by some students who entered the iGEM competition for synthetic biology back in 2010. And what they did was their project is called Bacillophila, which is like my favorite pun ever. And you guys are laughing, unlike every other audience I've ever presented this to. So Bacillophila is just modified E. coli that when they're in the presence of this crack or whatever medium they want to put them in, they extrude some epoxies, some filamentous materials, and some calcium carbonate. And actually here you can see that it frickin' works. They actually there's the crack in the concrete up there in the left, And you can see the bacteria growing into the crack and closing that crack up. And it actually is stronger afterward because of the calcium carbonate and filaments actually make a very strong bond there. And so the dream, of course, is that if you have a bridge that, say, cracks in a quake, that you can just go out and smear some of this stuff on there and actually heal it. Or even in a much more futuristic scenario, be incorporating components like this into the actual building of your buildings, so that if your building does develop a crack, it can actually heal itself. And of course, you don't have to do this using biological materials, although I personally think that that's a little bit more awesome. You can also use biomimicry. So there's a lot of self-healing polymers that are actually on the market now, where you can get materials that they're kind of like metals, and if they break, they kind of create this scar-like seam. And currently, these self-healing polymers are being used as sealants on ship hulls. So you can actually buy this as a commercial product if you own an awesome giant tanker or whatever. So not yet ready for my laptop. So I think that that's another avenue to be thinking of how we would build cities, how we would incorporate biology into cities. And I want to tell you a little bit about something somewhat science fictional. I was talking to an architect, David Benjamin, who does work with synthetic biologists. He's part of this kind of group. He's part of a group in New York called The Living, which is a group of synthetic biology architects, or so they think of themselves. And he's part of a growing group of designers and industrial designers who are trying to reach out to synthetic biologists and to anybody who's really working on engineering biology to think about how to incorporate these kinds of recent discoveries into their designs. And so I was talking to David Benjamin about his vision for the city of the future. And of course, he's being very speculative. He's thinking about something that could exist in like 100 years or 200 years. And he was saying, well, what if we could program seeds to grow into buildings, which seems a little bit far-fetched, but more realistically, what if we could program matter to grow into the perfect wall? And it would be a synthesis of different biological substances that worked really well together to be really strong, to be some kind of permeable membrane that might allow air in, that might allow water in when you wanted it, or keep water out when you didn't. He was thinking of a city that was literally, as in this science fictional picture, kind of grown using living materials that had been heavily modified. So something like that sensor array that we heard about this morning in the airport, where you might have plants that were sensors that were sensing different chemicals or different explosive materials, this would be a whole city that was designed around that idea. And you might have, say, cyanobacteria used as a water filtration system or an atmosphere filtration system. You might have biofuels everywhere. You might be growing biofuels all over the place. This might be your biofuel. So the idea is that at some point, if we can really use what we're learning today, we might see a future where cities are robust against disaster because they are completely living organisms that are absolutely connected to their ecosystems around them. And this could, of course, also lead to actually functional geoengineering, where we're repairing the environment or modifying the environment to be more beneficial to ecosystems rather than what we're doing now, which is not quite as beneficial as we might hope. So I wanted to conclude by getting even more futuristic on you. Oops, that's not futuristic. So I want to conclude by talking about where humanity might go, once we fix this problem of how we build our cities and maintaining them in a way that's carbon neutral and robust against disaster. What do we do once we've kind of been able to shepherd the carbon cycle, when we can actually think about the idea that maybe we could control the carbon cycle in the same way we control agricultural lands, where we're really farming the atmosphere. Well, one of the big problems is eventually, even if we're super good citizens, we never burn another ounce of fossil fuel, the planet is still in danger. As I mentioned, there are megavolcanoes. Those things go off, you know, they're not gonna stop going off. Asteroids are zooming around in space. One of them's gonna hit us again eventually. So if we really wanna have a robust human civilization, we've got to colonize other planets. Or we've got to build structures that are off-world. This is part of a million-year plan for the species. You know, we're mammals. Typical mammal species lifespan is about 1 million years. We've been around about 200,000 years, depending on who you listen to. It's a little bit of debate. So we've got a lot of time left as a species. So thinking about all that future, how would we do it? How would we use biology to help us get into space? So when I typically say this to people, they are usually super excited, like, yes, we're gonna be living on Mars in like 10 years. No, 20 years maybe. No. Unfortunately, I wish that that were true. But I think a good thought experiment for going into space is to think about when humans first crossed the ocean on boats. That was about 50,000 years ago. Humans who were living, Homo sapiens, who were living in the region which we now call Asia, used boats very much like this, reed boats, to cross through the Pacific, and they wound up in Australia. There's ample fossil evidence that Homo sapiens was hanging out in Australia and killing the megafauna about 50,000 years ago. We finished killing the megafauna later. But anyway, so at that time, that was our first major journey. And I think now, with our spaceships and our robots, we're kind of there. We're kind of crossing distances between planets right now in equipment that's kind of like a reed boat. It does the job. It got us to the moon. Probably will get us to Mars. But we have a long way to go. And part of the reason is things like rocket fuel. You may have noticed that rocket fuel is not sustainable. So there's been a lot of questions in the space community about how would we sustainably get to space? So one idea that was come up with in the 90s, not the crazy 70s, the supposedly sane 90s, is this idea of a space elevator. And how many people have heard of space elevators? Okay, awesome. So a space elevator is a sustainable way of getting humans and equipment out of the gravity well without using your rocket fuel. The idea is you, using technologies that have not been invented yet, you create an elevator ribbon. Currently, the idea is we would use carbon nanotubes. I highly doubt that that's what's going to happen. It's really a difficult problem. But anyway, you have a tether that's about 60 miles long with a counterweight at the end of it that's in geostationary orbit around the planet. And basically, that's just like you have a rope between your counterweight and the planet. And then you have robots with arms that climb up that tether. And what would it be fueled with? Having talked to the folks at NASA and some of the people who are actually working on this project, I've been told lasers will fuel it. Again, I think this is the X technology, right? What will fuel it? Currently, lasers. But we actually have the robot technology already. We have great climbing robots. And the idea would be you'd have an elevator car that was a sleeper car, and it would take you about 3 days to get up to a reasonable place outside the gravity well. And then you would catch a spaceship to go wherever you wanted to go next. And this would allow us to do things like build structures in space much more cheaply. And it would allow us to bring people, like I said, out of the gravity well on a regular basis. And if you've ever read Kim Stanley Robinson's novel Red Mars, you know that if you knock a space elevator down, it looks really cool. Don't do that. The idea is that eventually, I think, if we survive as a species, and I think we will, we are going to be figuring out ways to get into space. We're going to be using the technologies that we're inventing right now to start geoengineering on other planets after we figure out that no one else is living on those planets, and after we figure out how to do things like make ourselves and make our whatever animals and plants we want to bring with us resistant to resistant to radiation. And there's actually people working on that now, trying to figure out what aspects, what genes are responsible for DNA repair if it's exposed to various kinds of radiation. So this is a far future vision, very far. The idea that we would have re-engineered ourselves in order to leave this particular set of ecosystems for other ecosystems on other worlds. It's funny because when I was working on my book and I was talking to people about this, every scientist I talked to, when I started to ask about engineering humans, just freaked out. No, we would never do that. Never, never, never. We would never modify humans. We would never do, of course you might do gene therapy or something like that, but they would, the idea that you would modify a human to live on another planet, absolutely no way, 100%. I didn't get a single scientist to go on record saying that they would ever in any way endorse that. But I was talking to Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction writer I mentioned earlier, and he was like, well, of course we will. And it's the premise of pretty much every sort of future-looking science fiction story you read that takes place in space, that humans have modified themselves, we've speciated, we've done all this crazy shit. And I was like, and I said to Stan, I was like, so all the scientists say no, what do you think is going to be the thing that's going to take us from every scientist saying no to just constantly modifying ourselves? And his theory was longevity technology. He said, as soon as we figure that out, as soon as we figure out a way to modify the genome to make people live for 200 years, that's it. The floodgates open. So that's his theory. I don't know if it's true or not. We'll see. I'm personally not that interested in longevity technology, but other people like it. So I want to just end with the idea that humans, we are going to make it through a mass extinction. There is a mass extinction coming, whether it's soon because of how we've meddled in the carbon cycle, whether it's in 1,000 years because we get smacked by another asteroid. We have all of the characteristics of a survivor species. So there's many pathways we could take to survival. We could either become like underground dwellers who are eating bugs and moss, which isn't bad, but I like a little more variety in my diet. Or we could start thinking about how to be building better cities and building a better future using not just biological components, but taking our inspiration from how ecosystems function and how environments function to regulate themselves, and starting to participate in that and helping to shape that in a way that's beneficial. So we are going to survive, and as you all know, we're all going to end up evolving into something else. And so I think that our real goal as a species should be, hopefully at some point, there's going to be some creature who looks back at us the way we look at Homo erectus and is like, oh yeah, those guys. Like, when you guys look at Homo erectus, Homo erectus had fire, okay? That was awesome, right? And so we look back and we think fondly of Homo erectus. And so hopefully at some point, whoever's living there will look back at us and say, that was so cute when they invented synthetic biology. Thanks a lot. All right, thanks very much.
Well, a very uplifting way to end the meeting. Are there any questions for Annalee? Yeah. So how do we, here's one over there. Jim Bristow has one.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. My children tend to be somewhat pessimistic about the global warming situation and how I personally have screwed it up for them. And I wonder how your message is variably perceived by people of my age at 60, and I'm sure you share this story with kids that are in their 20s, and how if there are differences in how people sort of think about this.
Yeah, I mean, the difference, I haven't noticed as much a generational difference in how people respond, but I have gotten generally, I've gotten a lot of confusion from the environmentalist community because one of the main messages to the public from environmentalists has been, you are all bad, you are all gonna die, and you fucked everything up. I'm sorry, you screwed everything up. And I mean, maybe that's true. I mean, I think a lot of us, well, all of us are gonna die, but I think that the species, you know, there may be a bottleneck at some point caused by some kind of population crash. I think that's perhaps likely. And I think we obviously, our ancestors, you know, did start the Industrial Revolution, and of course that has perturbed the carbon cycle. But I also think that in the scientific community, what I've found heartening is that people are willing to look at the evidence from history and say, okay, we can see that this has happened before. We've had radical perturbations in the carbon cycle before. Life has survived. And so then I think it's just a question of, what do we do to survive? And you know, the fact is that even if you think that we've been naughty, and even if you think that we deserve to die, the fact is that we're not, as a species, going to die out. I mean, we have all these characteristics of a survivor species. And so it's kind of this sense that that there is this dark time coming. It's kind of, in a sense, kind of irrelevant. It's really a question of what are we going to do about the dark time that's coming? Because either way, our progeny are going to be there. There's going to be humans there to see, like, if it becomes chud. I don't know if you guys remember chud, but anyway, it's cannibalistic humanoid underground dwellers, brought to you by the 1980s. So whether it's that kind of like we're, you know, that, or whether we're living in like, you know, the world that JGI builds out of, you know, solar fuels and biofuels and like cities that are built out of living organisms, you know, that's up to us. And so it is difficult. I mean, there's always the question of how do you convince people that even if they feel crappy, they still need to do something about it. You know, and maybe we are going to have to suffer through some terrible population crash before people are really convinced that they need to do something. So yeah, but like I said, I don't think it's generational. I think it's more science versus anti-science responses.
Okay, do we have any other questions? One back there.
Hi, thank you. Very fun talk there. So assuming we are an enduring species and we can make it through a catastrophic event, what do you think the chances are that we will be able to rebuild a technological civilization, given that we've burned up all the easy-to-access resources that allowed us to get to this place in the first place?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that there is always a kind of arms race in terms of finding fuels and energies. I mean, we see that not just among humans trying to find new sources of energy and fuel, like in our lifetime, where we're looking to biofuels, for example, to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. But you see it also in evolution, right? You know, you see competition for new sources of fuel, new sources of energy. So I think even if we suffer through some kind of catastrophic crash of civilization, you always have to ask yourself, what do you mean by crash of civilization? Do you mean that, you know, America falls? Do you mean that New York falls? Do you mean that we lose access to all of our hard drives because of DRM, and then in the future we don't have a way to decrypt all of the crap on them? I mean, which is an actual scenario that we might have to worry about. So I think, like I said, I think in the long term, we are going to survive. I do think it's possible that in the short term, and when I say short term, I mean like the next 100 or 200 years, we might see some terrible setbacks, and we might see famines, and we might see running out of fossil fuels. But I do think that in that arms race, at least a subset of our progeny will make it through and figure it out.
Okay, I think we should all thank Annalee.